Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So we're recording. Welcome to Bottom Up or Bust, Why Local Politics is the Key to Defeating Duopoly. So I'm going to introduce PPB and our guests. Our organization, Progressive Party Builders, supports the bottom-up development of a viable progressive party in the United States. We've been active for about 3 years, and our main activities have been endorsing candidates, hosting workshops like this one, and collaborating with and influencing like-minded other party building efforts. So our core team, my name is Lynette McLean, and I am coming to you from Colorado. Jonathan Martin is coming to you from Massachusetts. Noel Bjorkus is in Minnesota. Peter Layton is in California. And Sarah Miller is in Georgia. So we'll be, Peter's going to be our timekeeper, and Sarah's going to be moderating our chat, our questions and answer. And Noel and Jonathan will be doing our presenting, and I'm your moderator. So we have two guests here that are also going to be speaking, our key speakers. Jeremy Hansen is an associate professor of computer science at the Norwich University. And he's also a longtime state committee member of the Vermont Progressive Party, which was the most successful third party in the contemporary United States. Kshama Sawant has served in the Seattle City Council since 2014. And she's a member of the Socialist Alternatives, a national organization that calls for the creation of a new working class party in the United States. So welcome to both of you. Okay, so I'm going to summarize our agenda a little bit here, and then we'll get started. First off, we're going to present a broad rationale for bottom-up progressive party building, and we're going to let the other two speakers fill in the illustrative details based on their experiences and their observations of their own third-party movements. Noel and Jonathan are going to talk about why we need a viable bottom-up progressive party in the context of U.S. politics today and in recent decades. And then Jeremy's going to discuss how the Vermont Progressive Party history illustrates the potential of bottom-up approaches for party building. And then Kshama will talk about how her history as a successful candidate and city council member in Seattle also suggests why progressive party builders should focus on local politics. After each presentation, we're going to have some questions and answers. And you can ask a question by posting it in the chat. So please stay muted during the presentations. We're going to finish up in about a half an hour. About an hour and a half. So first, we're going to address why we need a viable progressive third party. And then secondly, why it has to be built from the bottom up. Go ahead, Noel, you can start.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Why do we need to build a progressive party outside of the two-party system? Today, in the past, and increasingly in recent decades, the U.S. has been dominated by a corporate duopoly, two corrupt parties that heavily favor the wealthy and privileged, and not the non-rich vast majority of people. Across the board, on a broad range of policies, economic policies, social and cultural policies, environmental policies, we find that Republicans and leading Democrats refuse to strongly side with most people who actually want a much more equal, fair, and sustainable society. It is perhaps more obvious to many when right-wing Republicans rule under a Trump or a George W. Bush. It still has been true under Clinton, Obama, and now Biden. Regarding Biden, for instance, we see a refusal by the administration and its allies to fight for a higher minimum wage, aggressively take on the industries that are killing our environment, create a healthcare system devoted to patients rather than corporate profit, as well as a lack of interest in fighting for a much better deal for minorities and women. A prime example is Biden's refusal to honor his campaign promise of forgiving a portion of student debt, despite the fact that doing so would not require an act of Congress and could have been done on day one. At best, the positive changes that the Biden administration have advanced are relatively small and are temporary. For the most part, Biden and his peers have kept the promise that Biden made to his rich donors when he was a candidate. He said that nothing would fundamentally change for them. Meanwhile, at the state and local level, there are few major party politicians fighting unequivocally against the powerful and privileged instead of for the common good. And even if the National Democratic Party had policy prescriptions adequate to today's challenges, which is not, it has long since abandoned support for and development of state party infrastructure, ceding that ground to reactionary forces and corporate interests. All of this stasis, this status quo, is more untenable than ever given the impending multiple crises we face in climate catastrophe, record inequality, threadbare healthcare offerings, which the pandemic has rapidly compounded, failing infrastructure, corrupt, militarized policing, repeated housing bubbles driven by hedge funds and large corporations, dire threats to democracy, whether it's from voter suppression or power consolidation. There's also a second order problem that arises from the inability or unwillingness of the duopoly to address our urgent needs. That is that over the last decades, more and more citizens have dropped out of participation in the democratic process. The largest voting bloc by far is the non-voters. Yet even in the face of this demoralization, fatal to any democracy, top Democratic Party power brokers have poured millions into defeating promising progressive candidates who have excited their potential constituencies by offering real solutions. So it is very clear that unless and until we build a viable alternative to the Democrats and Republicans, what we see now will be as good as it gets. And for most Americans, as polls suggest, that's nowhere near good enough. Jonathan Martin will now explain why a viable progressive third-party movement must be built from the bottom up.
All right, I hope everybody can hear me. And so why build a new party from the bottom up? Focusing first on winning elections and then policy fights at the local level. My simple answer is there are fewer and weaker obstacles to winning at the ground floor of electoral politics than at higher levels. It's much easier to make election and policy breakthroughs at the bottom, and in the process, build a base and network of supporters. At lower levels, it can take a lot less money to run a viable election campaign. Also, ballot access requirements tend to be much less stringent at those levels. For example, many fewer qualifying signatures are needed for local candidates, and third parties often don't have to get statewide ballot access in order to run municipal candidates and sometimes even state legislative candidates. Furthermore, in local races, there can be a lot less competition from other candidates and parties. In many places where one major party dominates, third-party candidates often face only a single opponent from one major party. And in many elections for local boards, and sometimes there are no opponents in those elections. Finally, at the local level, it can be much easier to get media attention and, importantly, to reach voters in person by going door to door. More deeply, a successful bottom-up strategy can address one of the biggest obstacles to third-party success: the widespread belief that third parties just can't win. That belief is only reinforced when national third parties run extreme long-shot, higher-level candidates who lose by huge margins. By contrast, winning just a small critical mass of local races and policy fights can convince many people that bigger things are possible. It can build an expanding base of supporters and potential strong candidates, which can become a springboard to more ambitious, higher-level campaigns and victories. In other words, running and winning in cities or towns can make it possible to create viable state candidates and parties, and eventually to run competitive federal candidates and build a truly national, viable national progressive third party. Of course, it may not be so easy for many third-party activists to accept a bottom-up approach. Pressing crises and social needs in the United States create a real sense of urgency to make political change now. But the fact is, normally, given the obstacles, a third party can't suddenly become competitive in statewide and federal elections. Electoral credibility and viability have to be built one necessary step at a time. From the bottom up, it takes time and effort. Lastly, there are many important changes that need to be made locally pertaining to wages, taxes, housing, the environment, racial justice, and more. So starting locally isn't just strategic for the sake of a larger party building goal, it also has inherent political value. which I think some of our other speakers will probably refer to. So I've presented a brief and general case for a bottom-up approach. More details about what I've said can be found in a short Counterpunch article published last year that I will post into the chat. And I'm glad to take questions about what I've said in the Q&A, where Noel will also be responding to those questions. Lynette?
Okay, Sarah. Yes, Sarah, do you have any questions from the chat? Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Annette. We don't have any questions from the chat right now.
Okay. Good to know. All right. Then next we'll go on to Jeremy. Jeremy's going to tell us how the Vermont Progressive Party history illustrates the potential of a bottom-up approach for party building. Please write your any questions you might have for Jeremy, or any questions you have in the chat. Go ahead, Jeremy.
All right, let me share my screen. Stand by. Okay, hopefully that's visible to everybody.
Looks good.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeremy Hansen. I live in Vermont, and I have served on the Vermont Progressive Party State Committee since probably 2013, 2014. I've run for office a couple times as a progressive for the state legislature, and I've not won at the state legislature, but I have served on my town select board, which is something like a city council. We just have smaller places here. So let me just dive into it. So the basic things I'm going to go over: the history, our successes, the current structure of how we do things here in Vermont, and then what our electoral process is. I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly, and hopefully, if you have any questions about any specific details, I can answer those at the end. So, kind of stepping through some of the highlights of our history. Things really started with the Vermont Progressives in 1981 with Bernie Sanders' win of the mayoral seat in our largest city, Burlington, in the northwestern side of Vermont. Also, Terry Baricius, who's the gentleman on the left in that picture, won a city council seat as a third-party candidate, and who was aligned with Bernie for that race. We went on to later start winning state house seats. Terry, the same person who won the city council seat in 1981, won one of the first legislative seats as a Vermont progressive in 1991. Later that year, the same year, actually, right about the same time, Bernie Sanders won his congressional seat, his first congressional race, about the same time. And then things started taking off as we had more and more candidates and more people choosing to run as progressives for the state legislature. It took some time. We formally were organized as a party in the state of Vermont in 1999 and achieved major party status. I think it was a cycle or two after that. So I think 2004 maybe was when we first got major party status. We got our first state Senate win in 2008, another in 2010, another in 2012, and have essentially held seats in the legislature and on the Burlington City Council since the dates that you see on here. There are no gaps where there was no progressive on the City Council, for example. Or since 1991, there's always been progressives in the Vermont legislature. In 2012, we earned our first statewide seat. Auditor Doug Hoffer, who ran as a fusion candidate, both as a Democrat and a progressive, won a seat in 2012. David Zuckerman won a seat for the seat of Lieutenant Governor in 2016 and is running for that again this year. So right now, the Burlington City Council there are exactly half of the Burlington City Councilors are progressives. The rest are Democrats and independents. There are no Republicans anymore on the Burlington City Council as of about 4 years ago. The mayor is a Democrat, but the largest voting bloc on the City Council are Vermont progressives. We have 7 current Vermont Progressive Party state representatives, and there are 5 more Democrats who have chosen to also affiliate themselves with the progressives to run as Democrats/progressives in the House. More than half of our elected progressives in the House identify as LGBTQ, and 6 of the 7 are women. And we have 2 current progressive state senators, and there are 3 more, like I said before, Democrats who identify partially as progressives. And then we have lots and lots and lots of folks elected to mostly nonpartisan offices on city councils, mayoral seats, select boards, and such. So some of the policy positions that progressives have championed for a long time that have finally come to fruition, either partially or totally: cannabis legalization. Those bills were introduced by progressives in the 1990s and eventually came to fruition after dragging Democrats and even some Republicans kicking and screaming into the conversation, kind of moving that Overton window over so that wasn't such a crazy idea anymore. It was advocated for hard enough and eventually came to be. Marriage equality, progressives were also at the forefront of that, even when we had moderate Democrats not as supportive as folks would hope. GMO labeling, that was something that was spearheaded largely by progressives and specifically by Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman, even before he was Lieutenant Governor. We played a part in the race for governor back in 2010, when then the Democratic candidate was promising a push towards universal health care, only to have the rug pulled up from underneath us as that same candidate who earned the progressive nomination decided that it was too expensive after all, with some smoke and mirrors. But the ultimate message here is that progressives are at the table. They are mentioned in media. They are consulted and part of the conversation in the legislature. We have tripartisanship. So when you have Democrats and progressives and Republicans and sometimes independents all coming to the table and agreeing, that's language that's used in our media. We have seats on the Legislative Apportionment Board. So following the census in 2020, the redrawing of legislative seats, there are 2 members of each major party represented there, and I had the privilege of serving as one of the progressives on that board. Unfortunately, the Democratic supermajority in the legislature decided to throw away the maps that the tripartisan Legislative Apportionment Board approved at the end of it. Progressive legislators also can participate in legislative caucus formation, which requires the consent of 2 parties to form. So we have a Working Vermonters Caucus, we have a Climate Caucus that would normally have to have Democrats and Republicans coming together, linking arms to do this, but we can have Democrats and progressives linking arms to put this together. The current structure is a lot of the day-to-day organization and some of the decision-making, spending of money and such is really done by the coordinating committee. There are at-large members who are elected by the state committee, and then there are officers who also serve on the coordinating committee. We have 1 full-time staffer and we have 1 part-time staffer, and sometimes that fluctuates depending on the needs of elections or things that are going on, but also available funds. There are House and Senate caucuses that meet each week in the State House. We have a state committee meeting, which are elected representatives from the county committees, which are in turn, elected from members of the town committees, and those town committees are constituted every 2 years. The state committee also have some other subcommittees on elections, fundraising, other things like that. That take on specific tasks that maybe the whole state committee isn't going to tackle, or the coordinating committee is not going to have time to focus in on. This is, by the way, this photo on the right here, this is a picture of our 2017 state committee meeting, and we have all sorts of elected officials and I don't know if you can see the gentleman laying down in the front. That's Doug Hoffer, the state auditor. So our first statewide candidate, looking very comfortable, sitting with all of the other progressives around him, and this is at the Vermont State House. So I'm going to give this a super high level view of how we run and win elections. It's really about networking. It's about who people know already. It's about those networks that folks have built by running for local office. It's not the coordinating committee saying you should run for governor, and then somebody runs for governor and puts them up, and then they sort of justify why. This is very, very bottom up. It's no coincidence that when Progressive Party builders invited me, that they knew I was going to say yes to present about this, because this is exactly how we are able to get to where we are. There's plenty of candidates who are organic that come to us that say, I want to run. And there's other candidates that, because we build networks in, social justice, racial justice, environmental justice communities, that we can have these conversations and say, you know what, you would be really good to run. And not that we do lots and lots of arm twisting, very gentle arm twisting, but we, suggest when we think people would be good to run. And then we take a data-driven look at how we can sort of prioritize the attention and the resources of the party. We're not supported by a national party. Everything that we do is focused on Vermont. Most of the fundraising that we do is coming from folks in Vermont. And then we have to look at how we prioritize those resources campaign by campaign. We maintain really good lists and data. Having run for office and seeing some of the data from the Democratic Party, my list in my legislative district was way better than what the Democrats had. So, and that would be something I would have had to pay for if they would let me, and they weren't going to let me. For the most part, the party stays reasonably behind the scenes for elections, letting the candidates speak for themselves. Runs logistics, manages things behind the scenes. But then when there aren't campaigns running, then they're out front with issues, highlighting the achievements of the elected folks and providing support for folks that might want to run in the future, and providing support for folks in the State House. Our State House is very small. Our legislature do not receive any staffers. There are no offices for elected folks. So it is by and large the parties that provide support and administrative bits and pieces to elected folks. And so this is where kind of the rubber meets the road. So real change. This is a picture from 1996. This is David Zuckerman on the right, Bernie in the center, and Dean Corrin, one of the first state representatives who ran as a progressive. This is something that we've been doing for a while, not me personally, but this is something that progressives have been doing for a while. And I want to just make sure that everybody is clear that this takes time. This requires a fair bit of motivation, and this requires playing the long game. Also requires knocking on doors, talking to everybody. And even when you're talking to people who are not going to agree with you, you still have to talk to them. It would be disrespectful not to. Now, if they, curse at you or threaten you, yeah, of course you want to the next house, but talking to them, putting the effort in to build those connections and build those bridges is valuable. There are people who in my town and nearby who would vote for me, who would never vote for any other progressive, because I've built those relationships with them. And even though they may identify as Republicans, even in some case Trump supporters, they would still vote for me as a crazy, wacky, left-wing progressive. Again, because of those relationships that I've built. And other folks find the same sort of thing. When Bernie has run in the past, he sometimes finds that his best the best results come from places that have been historically Republican. So it's worth talking to everybody. And then real change happens when you show up. It's not enough to sit and wait for somebody else to do it, or hope that there's somebody who's going to step forward and say they're great. It's going to require you to show up and take those first few steps. And so this is where I'm going to wrap things up and hopefully open it up for any questions that you might have. And you can't have I can't have a presentation without a Bernie meme here, so I'm going to bring out the Bernie meme. So I'm asking, you should run for local office. It should be you, not somebody else. I'm sure you can find some reason why you shouldn't or couldn't, or why you won't win. I've run 3 times and not won as a progressive. I'm still at it. So, and I would strongly recommend that you start thinking about that today. So I will leave it here and turn it back to Lynette.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was great. And you at the end there, you talked a lot about some of the things that we're going to talk about in our next workshop is the how you do it. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. So next is Kshama Sawant, and she's going to talk about how her political history. Oh wait, I forgot. I was going to do questions and answers. Is there any questions? Anybody have? Forgot about that. Anybody have any questions for?
Thanks for
Jeremy?
asking, Lynette. We do have quite a few questions to get through our Q&A.
Okay.
And I have already posed a few to Jeremy. If you can answer them, I would greatly appreciate that. And I
Sure.
will.
We have a
type
couple
them
of
up.
minutes, so we'll be okay. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay, so I see one question that says, please describe the differences in strategy between the Working Families Party's fusion strategy and the VPP's electoral strategy. So I'll start with that one, and there's a follow-up question with that. Working Families was in Vermont for some time, at the same time as the Progressives, and where the Working Families Party here anyways, and I think in New York too, has been seen more as an offshoot of the Democratic Party as a way of signifying maybe lowercase p progressive Democrats. We run candidates against Democrats when it makes sense. And there are times where, for example, I will run in a Democratic primary to crowd out Democrats who run, and then I will run primarily as a progressive. I will run as a P/D. It just shows up on the ballot as progressive/Democratic. And rather than the Working Families Party, which does, in my experience, and I could certainly be proven wrong, they tend to endorse Democrats that are already running, rather than trying to get a Working Families candidate to push out Democrats. I think there have been some cases of them doing that, but not so many. What's the Vermont Progressive Party's relationship to the DSA? It's really good. The DSA in Vermont, I know a lot of folks who are part of that. At least one, right off the top of my head, of our elected state representatives are members of the DSA. We work fairly closely together, and I would say DSA in Vermont is much more closely aligned to the progressives than they are to the Democrats. There is a little bit of overlap, but it's a pretty good relationship. Another question I got directly: in previous work, I vetted hundreds of progressive candidates for organizations. There are always extra obstacles for women and women of color and those with disabilities. Are there any third parties addressing this? One of the ways that we do this is, in particular, our coordinating committee is required to have a gender balance, first of all. So we encourage women and seek out women primarily, and really are considerate about when there are races, about making sure that women, minorities, or women, non-white folks, folks with disabilities, that if they want to run, that we'll typically not try to run a white cis male against them if we have if that's something that's out there. It's hard though. I'm just going to be straight. The census data came back, and Vermont is still really, really white. We do the best that we can to support the non-white folks that want to run, but there's not always lots of those folks here in the state. I see another question. What are some key successes of the Vermont Progressive Party that can translate to other states and localities? Just run. I mean, you have to start. You have to run, and you have to knock on doors. The notion that you can do a bunch of Facebook ads or run radio ads or TV ads or something like that may be true if you're running a statewide run, but having a bunch of people that believe in what you're doing, or even if initially they don't, you're going to talk to enough people as you knock on the doors that you will find that you will get more support. But it can't happen without that sort of starting knocking on doors. How many states allow fusion? So I don't actually know the answer to that. Vermont's fusion balloting is a bit different than some other places. How many states allow municipal party ballot lines? Don't know that either. We only have one place in Vermont, only one municipality in Vermont, and that's Burlington, that has partisan municipal races. We don't have strong county parties. Talking about the next question there. How many states are these stepping stones to state ballot access the way they are in Vermont? Yeah, so I'm going to be kind of willfully naive when it comes to other states, that because we are focused on Vermont, we don't color outside the lines too much. I'm happy to work with folks like Jonathan and Lynette and everybody at Progressive Party Builders, but the Vermont Progressive Party's focus is on Vermont. Vermont Progressive Party does not run candidates in New Hampshire or New York or Massachusetts, and that helps us. I don't want to necessarily say stay above the fray, but we are laser focused on those issues here, that when we talk to folks that we're knocking on their doors, that it makes sense what we're talking about. It's not some abstract, academic issue. It's something that is a meat and potatoes actual thing that the people that we're talking about care about. Let's see. Will fusion voting really be viable for building a third party in the long term? We're still here, and we've used fusion voting. There was a big debate about this in the Vermont Progressive Party in around 2006, and even still a little bit nowadays. If you think about it more as like kind of exploiting the electoral machinery, this is the way that I've explained it in the past, that I'm not running as a Democrat. I'm running so that a more conservative or moderate Democrat doesn't run. And if I can essentially get elected in their primary and then show up in the general election as a progressive, then you don't have this, vote splitting and the poor electoral system that we have with the first past the post and plurality voting. You don't have, if you have three candidates, you don't have the progressive and the Democrat running against each other essentially for 60% of the vote, and then the Republican wins with 30 or with 40. Are there not libertarians in Vermont? There are libertarians in Vermont. They were briefly a major party or minor party, not so much. All right. So I'm seeing, let's see, can you speak to any differences in engagement and receptivity to progressive issues in the years since Occupy? So I can say the thing that got me to the Progressive Party was Occupy, 100%. That was here in Vermont. I was not really part of it in New York. I was in Occupy DC for a very, very short time. But no, it was Occupy that really converted me, and then paying more attention to what was happening locally from there. Bernie's national campaigns, well, you all are here, and there weren't that many efforts to create progressive parties that were successful in the past. I think Bernie's brought the conversation to the mainstream. And let's see. So time for a few more questions. Let's see. At some point during the meeting, can speakers share their Twitter and or Facebook handles? Sure, I can do that in a bit. How did you manage to keep all your candidates, elected officials accountable? We're building relationships. Vermont's a small place, frankly. So basically all of the elected officials, I can call them on their cell phones, address them by name. Vermont's kind of weird like that, so that's not necessarily going to be the case everywhere. But because we are a reasonably tight-knit group, you do have folks sometimes not behaving well or not always voting as a block. For the most part, the progressives in the legislature, they don't whip their members. So it's not like you have to line up, this is what the party wants and you must obey. More often you have the Democrats trying to whip our members and say, this is what you have to do, which I remember she's not in the legislature anymore. I remember she recounted a time when the House Majority Leader said, you really ought to vote for this. And she said, I don't work for you, and walked away. and then voted her conscience or voted according to her constituents rather than taking a party line, but still thinking about working Vermonters and what was right for Vermonters, and not taking necessarily a ideological or specifically partisan position. So you can't always keep the elected officials accountable, especially when, again, these are individuals. These are people who are not coming from institutions that are supporting them with lots of corporate money or anything where they're supposed to be obeying one way or the other. So Lynette or Jonathan or Sarah, tell me when I should shut up, because these are still coming to me. I'll just keep talking. I'm a professor. I can do this forever.
We've got a couple more minutes, so why don't you take maybe the next couple?
Okay, sounds good. Has there been any conversation in Vermont regarding direct ballot initiatives as a way to have impact on policy based upon the will of the people? Yes, the conversation has been there. There has been interest in this. I'm not sure that there's really we'll say, political will from folks outside of the Progressive Party, except for a handful of Democrats or independents, to make that happen. But yeah, it may require a constitutional change in the state, but that's not completely been an obstacle before. But yeah, we've certainly talked about it for a long time. That's something that I've been very interested in since I joined the party. All right, so last but not least, it says, you mentioned candidates running as Democrats and as progressives. How can someone be a Democrat and a progressive in an election? Is this only in Vermont? So we have what's called fusion ballots, fusion voting in Vermont. So the way this works for me, when I've run in the past, I run in the Democratic primary. I can only run in one primary at a time. The progressives are a major party, therefore we get primary ballots. But I run the Democratic primary. I've won them in the past. And then because there are no other folks running in the progressive primary, essentially the district committee will come together and nominate someone to fill that vacancy. So I get the nomination of two parties and I get to choose the order. So I run as a progressive / Democrat. Some other states allow this sort of thing. I think Jonathan posted in the chat that there's maybe 10 states that allow this. So the obstacles are the obstacles to ballot access and the obstacles to showing up as a progressive in other states they're different in Vermont compared to other places.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was great, and good questions, everybody. That was nice. I just want to say quickly before we go on to Kshama that Jonathan, this last year, he did a study, did some research at his college on how, and maybe I'll let him speak more intelligently about it, but what the voting requirements are to start a third party in all 50 of the United States. So I just wanted you to maybe say a few words, Jonathan, maybe about fusion voting or about your research, whatever. It's a couple minutes, maybe.
Okay, I'll try to be quick about it. Now, regarding fusion, someone corrected me in the chat. I think it was Mark Ortiz that it may be 9 states that allow fusion, but the fact is that the rules vary in each state. And again, fusion means that as a candidate, you can be endorsed by more than one party and have both of those party labels on the ballot. So you can be Working Families Party and Democrat, for example, and that happens in a number of states. But again, the rules vary from state to state about exactly at what level you can do that and how you can do it. The vast majority of states, it is not legal. There is a big debate among people in the third party movement about whether or not it's a good idea. I know the Vermont Progressive Party uses it. Although when their candidates do also run as Democrats, they can designate themselves as progressive first and Democrat secondarily, and they can caucus with the progressive, so that it shows that they are leaning towards a third party, even if they are not exclusively endorsed by it. I think that's an important distinction. But yeah, there is a debate about fusion. Some people feel like it kind of leads a third party towards co-optation. Others think that it can be a tool and you can exploit that opportunity to only compete against one other major party in an election. So we're not going to settle that here, but I think that, you should be aware that that is an issue to consider with respect to strategy if you happen to be in a fusion state. If you're not, it's irrelevant. Briefly about my other research, I won't go on about it. I'm just doing research about ballot access in the United States. And one interesting finding there is that in roughly half of the states, you do not need statewide ballot access in order to run as a state legislative candidate. You can self-designate a party label. And so it is often assumed that candidates with third parties who are running at the state level or at the local level have to get statewide ballot access first. In many states, that is not the case. Even with respect to races for state offices, that is not the case in many states. In some states it is, but that's important because when it comes to devising a strategy, you don't necessarily want to leap to gaining statewide ballot access when you don't have to, and you can just have someone designate their party label on the ballot and run with that. So that's all I'll say about that. Maybe in some other workshop, I'll present a little bit more about some of my findings. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we'll have time at the end for more questions and answers. And if you'd like to have a discussion, we'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards. So, all right. So next up, Kshama Sawant is going to talk to us about how her political history illustrates the potential for a bottom-up approach to party building. So go ahead, Kshama.
Thank you, Lynette, and thanks for having me. I'm glad all the speakers started with the need for a progressive party outside of the Democrats and Republicans. And I would, of course, frame it as the need for a party for the of, by, and for the working class. And as many of you have said, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans represent the mass of the American people who are not rich, not to mention the larger phenomenon of the healthcare crisis, the global challenge of climate catastrophe that is facing us. All of this, and we're observing how even the election of squad members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has not resulted in the change that many working people were hoping and expecting from that. And the other side to it, of course, which I think we need to mention, why there is such an urgent need to build a party of the working class, is the selling out by the Democrats, the complete and utter failure of the Biden administration to deliver anything, the inability of the squad to really stand out in any way against the Democratic establishment, has all of that together created and resulted in this dangerous growth of right populism. And Trump was defeated, but Trumpism is far from gone in any way. We've seen stunning attacks on abortion rights in state after state. We know that might happen also on a federal level. The attacks on communities of color, the LGBTQ community, and we are, as even the Democrat-leaning newspapers are openly saying, there's going to be a shellacking by the Republicans of the Democrats in the midterm elections, and there is a real prospect of the return of Trump or Trump-like figure, right populist figure in 2024. So all of this again is really highlighting the urgency of building the political alternative for working people, and absolutely the bedrock of such a party will have to be rank and file democracy. And I don't think we can think of this as an optional thing, or that, well, the elected officials, those who get elected from such a party, well, they're individuals, you can't always hold them accountable. Yes, there will be those things, but the goal of the party should absolutely be to hold all of the elected leaders accountable, and we need to discuss how that can happen. And this party should run candidates. Of course, such a party should run candidates, and I agree with those who spoke just now and correctly mentioned the electoral challenges, the ballot access challenges, which, of course, we should recognize they're not a bureaucratic accident. These challenges are deliberate systemic features to block any working class initiative to win our own positions that unambiguously represent us, unambiguously represent those who are exploited by the capitalist system. But I honestly don't believe that the straightforward solution to this is to just say, okay, let's run municipal or local elections versus congressional or other larger campaigns, And I also don't believe that if the ballot access obstacles were magically eliminated, which they won't be because they serve a purpose for the ruling class, that it would lead to a fundamentally different kind of politics than the Democrats. I think the question is much deeper than that. I mean, yes, it is true. Logistically, it's easier to run a local campaign. And, of course, Socialist Alternative has a lot of experience having won 4 elections since 2013. And the logistical challenges should certainly figure as a consideration in deciding which campaign we should run as progressive. And absolutely, we should have a serious political strategy, because we should not just run willy-nilly campaigns. We should run campaigns where we feel we have a real chance either to win or to make a real impact on the political agenda. And yes, it takes time and efforts, as my fellow speakers have said. But I should clarify for my part, I don't believe that this is going to be an incremental process, or that it should be an incremental process. And I certainly don't believe that it is about accumulating elected seats that are progressive in name. I mean, let's be brutally honest. I mean, there are many more self-described progressives in office at every level today as compared to, say, 2013 when I was first elected. At that time, it was a new thing that, that such a thing has happened. But since then, for example, 150 or so DSA members, including myself, I'm also a member of DSA in addition to being a member of Socialist Alternative, but roughly 150 DSA candidates have been elected. But honestly, other than our office in Seattle and some other rare elected offices like that of Chicago Alderman Byron Lopez, very few examples do we have of any of them really using their position to fighting for working people. So I think we have to be very honest with ourselves. It is not just about accumulating seats that are progressive in name. We need elected positions. The working class, the challenge posed by the climate crisis, all of this needs elected positions that can be part of larger movements that together can collectively fight to win major victories. It's not about those seats. It's about winning victories. Can we win a living wage for all workers? Can we win Medicare for all? Can we cancel the student debt? Can we fund a massive expansion of social housing by taxing big business? Can we win rent control without loopholes? Or, can we make housing available? Can we actually make sure that people have decent jobs and decent lives? That is what we're talking about. And none of this can be accomplished. I mean, it's a non-starter unless we lay the groundwork through a fighting strategy. A working class party is worth building if it is rooted in social movements and labor struggles. Our own experience shows in Seattle, and I'll describe that a little bit, shows that we cannot win with just having elected positions without larger struggles outside of, outside of the halls of power, outside City Hall, outside Congress, struggles of working people. Conversely, though, when you do have such larger movements and larger struggles, then you can win enormous victories even when you have only a minority of elected positions. So concretely in Seattle, I mean, this is our 9th year in Seattle City Hall. And over the last 8 years, it's still been just one socialist council office, mine, and all other 8, there are 9 council members, all other 8 council members are Democrats. And the bitter truth is that most of the self-described progressive Democrats have not actually been on the side of working people who are, wanting to change their lives for the better. In fact, they have been a conscious and deliberate obstacle for us to win anything. When we start, when we launch any struggle, there's not one single vote in favor of it, whether it is labor struggle or renter struggle or any other progressive aspect, stopping the sweeps of homeless neighbors. And none of that has any votes in favor of it other than my office. But despite that, we have won unparalleled victories because we have successfully used our office to build those larger movements or campaigns with ordinary people, rank and file union members, non-unionized workers getting involved and empowered. It was on that basis that we were able to make Seattle the first major city to win the $15 an hour minimum wage, which, as we know, many other cities went on to win after that. The 15 Now movement campaign that we launched here then went to many other cities like Minneapolis and Los Angeles and was able to win those victories. Bernie Sanders took it up and put pressure on the Clinton campaign in 2016. Then in 2020, in the midst of the George Floyd movement, we were able to win the Amazon tax. I mean, this is unheard of, taxing the largest corporations like Amazon. As you all know, Amazon and Starbucks are headquartered in Seattle. And those victories against those corporations was a small but important part of now what's happening on a much more gigantic and much more historic scale, which is the worker fight back and this just absolutely stunning victory by Amazon labor union at the warehouse on Staten Island, and then now they're getting ready for the second union election at a second sorting facility on Staten Island. I mean, all of this is what we need. So I would not pose it so much as local versus congressional. As I said, of course, logistical challenges should be taken into account, but I think there's a danger of getting too preoccupied with those kinds of details. I think what we should be preoccupied with is the political approach that is needed not only to win these elected positions for the working class, but also what can be accomplished and what that will take. If you're going to win something concrete, then what will it take? Yes, it's a long game, but it is also much more strategic than that. I mean, just to give you an example, if even one member of the 6-member squad in Congress was willing to fight the way we have fought in Seattle, it could make just historic shifts in our society, because it's a question of what pressure you can put and how you can expose the rotten Democratic and Republican establishments. I don't honestly think that it is about everyone who's progressive running for office. I mean, for Socialist Alternative, it was a very, very, it was not a straightforward question at all. Should we run a candidate was a major question for us, because we don't believe that, as I said, winning electoral positions is where it's at. We need electoral positions, and we do need a party of the working class. I don't agree with many, well-meaning workers, especially young people who understandably are fed up with the Democrats and feeling betrayed and turning away from elections entirely. I don't think that is going to be fruitful for us. But nor do I believe that elections are the main arena where working people can succeed. What we need is a working class party and elected representatives who will fight alongside ordinary people. And that's the approach we took from day one. So when Socialist Alternative had this discussion, even though we are a democratically run organization with elected recallable leaders, and when we started this discussion in 2013, the discussion didn't start with me promoting myself as a candidate and then the organization stood alongside me. It was completely the other way around. We together, the elected leadership, which I'm a part of, we discussed with our membership. Maybe there was an opening, and Jeremy correctly mentioned Occupy. Occupy was a very important turning point, and it was clear in the post-Occupy era that the Democrats were simply going to say, well, let's just hunker down and vote for Obama. No other political strategy, really. We completely disagreed with that. We saw that there was a hunger from millions of young people to see a different kind of politics, and we wanted to test it out. So that's how it started, and I think that is a good example. I mean, we don't believe that Socialist Alternative is that working class party. We think that we need a much bigger, we don't have delusions of grandeur. We need a much bigger platform. That is why, as Lynette mentioned earlier, Socialist Alternative calls for nationwide party for the working class, and we want to be part of that party of the working class. But the approach we use, I think, offers a lot in terms of political education for how we can build this new party. So I think the starting point of going away from personality-based politics to, or sort of working class politics, where the political agenda for the working class is at the center, not who runs. Obviously, who runs absolutely matters. You can run somebody and then they might not have the moral or political backbone to stand with you. And I'll come to that in a second, why that is so crucial. But the point is that the starting question is, can we run a campaign that is viable? What should the campaign platform be? So all of those were part of our democratic discussion. Should we make $15 an hour the main, sort of the banner of the campaign? What else should we run on? Should we call for taxing the wealthy? Should we call for rent control? All of this was part of the discussion. And indeed, who the candidate should be was also absolutely a democratic discussion, debate, and vote. I mean, honestly, I was not happy when I was chosen as a candidate. But the point is, we all have to play a role. for building working class movements, and not all of it is going to be comfortable. But what's good about this is that it wasn't like some sort of self-promotional thing. It was decided by the membership. I think that is absolutely the model we need to use for the working class party if we are going to even have a starting point of accountability. Another aspect of accountability that we have in Socialist Alternative is that all our elected officials, whether it is in City Hall or something like that, or elected labor leaders, we all pledge to take only the average worker's wage. So even though the City Council now pays me $146,000, actually it's more than that at this point, a year, that's my technical salary, I take home only $40,000, and the rest after taxes goes into a solidarity fund that Socialist Alternative democratically decides to. It's not a charity, it's a solidarity fund. So we donate to labor struggles or social movements like Black Lives Matter and renter struggles and so on. That is that's not everything about accountability, but the average worker's wage is very much part of accountability, because you see when the distance in the living standards of elected leaders or non-elected leaders of social movements are completely divorced from the reality of the mass of ordinary people, that is very much part of the slippery slope of selling out. It's not everything, but it is a very important part of it. So it's really crucial, actually, that the Amazon Labor Union, for example, that just won this historic victory, if you look at their constitution, they say that the executive board members of the union should not make any more than the average salary of the membership. This is crucial, and it is absolutely unique. I have not seen, speaking as a rank and file member of the labor movement, I have not seen any other union do this. It is crucial that we do this not only in the future party of the working class, but that rank and file union members fight for that as part of the accountability by the leaders. But accountability, honestly, is also still a far bigger challenge. I mean, accountability comes from, in our view, in Socialist Alternative, being willing to use your position, elected position, to build struggles to win victories. But that is easier said than done, because when you start doing that, that puts you directly at odds with the Democrats and the big business and the big developers, all the power brokers, and it absolutely will make your daily life uncomfortable and difficult. So when we choose who's going to be our candidate for the working class, we have to it has to be a twofold process. One, the organization has to be strong and united and cohesive, so that we can stand with our elected representatives, because it can get extremely difficult if you're all alone, because you will be all alone in the midst of Democrats who say they're progressive but will viciously fight against any working class agenda. On the other hand, you also need elected representatives who will have the political clarity. It's not just about moral backbone, although that is also important, but it's about the political clarity in understanding that when you go to work every day, and this is what I, just speaking personally, when I go to work every day at City Hall, I don't look at other council members, the Democrats, as my colleagues, if I was a Starbucks worker. Absolutely, my co-workers and I have to have solidarity. That is essential, working class solidarity. But that idea absolutely does not apply to the leadership positions, where other leaders are not your colleagues if they represent the class interests of the elite. Then they are going to be against you. So you cannot prioritize your personal comfort and your personal relationships with them. And I'm emphasizing this so much because that is one of the least understood things about how you bring accountability, and that is one of the hardest nuts to crack. A lot of well-meaning people, genuinely well-meaning people, will run for office, and when they win office, they will realize that it is extremely difficult to fight for the working class if you are not willing to then accept that, yes, the Democrats are going to be your enemy, and they're going to consider you their class enemy, because you absolutely are. If you're fighting for working people, you are a class enemy of the bosses, and so that is how it is. That is how it's going to look, and you have to constantly remind yourself that your solidarity is with working people outside City Hall. And so it is much easier to not be isolated or marginalized when you build those larger struggles. And that is how we have defeated the Democrats and every attempt that they have made in Seattle to try and isolate or marginalize our office. And then last but not least, as I said, you have to have a strong political organization that stands with you, and the organization itself has to be accountable to working people and big business. So a big part of our success in Seattle, it's not just me, it's because Socialist Alternative as an organization is 100% clear that we are rooted in the working class. We are not accountable to big business. In fact, we are an organization that advocates for a socialist society, and we are accountable to our members, and our members are accountable to the larger working class that we are a part of. And I would also say just this in closing, that it would be a mistake, as I alluded to earlier, that this all of what I'm describing, it would just be important in relation to political office, for the rank and file of labor unions, for workplace struggles, for social movements like BLM. Holding leaders, elected or otherwise, to high standards of accountability is not an optional position or a purity test, but it is a life or death imperative to have any hope of change in our society. Careerism, reformism, and parliamentary calculus are dead ends. The rank and file leadership of the West Virginia teachers strike in 2018 won only because they exposed the insider deal of the higher up union officials, rejected that deal, and kept on fighting. That should be our map and guide, the path of class struggle, where we demand accountability from our own leaders, not the insider calculus of House committees or City Hall committees, whatever that might be. So I hope I was able to share something useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I really, I'm so happy that you were here and were able to talk to us about your experience. If you could turn your mic audio down a little bit, it was a little bit loud. It wasn't terrible, but it was just a little bit loud. So turn it down a little bit, and then we'll take questions. Go ahead, Sarah. I mean, I don't know if Sarah, if you've just sent them to Kshama or, yeah, okay, go ahead.
We're just gonna give a few minutes to adjust the sound, and then we'll post the questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Is this volume better?
It's a little better, but it's still loud, really loud.
It's a little bit of an echo.
Little echo.
Okay, I'm not sure. I'll try to speak more softly. Unfortunately, when I get when I start talking about politics, I will try my best, and I apologize for the sound quality.
That's okay. We were able to understand you fine, so.
Okay.
We'll start with first question. Do you have a book coming out or a future book that you're working on?
Yes, there should be a book coming out, hopefully later this year or early next year. Yeah, unfortunately, it has been something that we've been intending to do since 2014, but real life struggles have been getting in the way, and so it has been a much postponed project, which we hope to take up and finish very soon.
Okay, quick question for the technical aspects. Do you have headphones that are in that maybe if you take them out, that might adjust the sound better?
I did take out my earphones, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Should I read the questions that are in the chat and answer them?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So there's a question, could you please speak to the distinction between the concept of party as a purely electoral organization versus party as an organic organization of the working class, can hold elected officials accountable and also provide infrastructure that officials need when they're in office? Yeah, I think this goes to the core of what kind of party we need. We absolutely need a party that can run for office. I don't think it works for a political organization to not run candidates. However, it needs to be a party that is, as I said, rooted in the working class. But just to concretize it, what would it mean? Had we had a working class party today, for example, then I would suggest a strategy where, for example, right now we would have absolutely thrown a lot of our resources and our political, shared our political strategy with the Starbucks union struggle, the Amazon workers union struggle, as much as possible, and then in the context of that, figure out strategically what campaigns we could run based on the momentum that workers were building. So, in other words, it wouldn't be. If it's a successful party, I don't think it would be a party that is just running candidates everywhere for the sake of running them, but rather strategically looking at these questions in terms of where can we run, where we can have the biggest impact, and maybe does it make sense to run in New York this year because of the momentum around the Amazon workers. And I think it also has to be a party, talking about research and so on. Obviously, research and communication needs to be there. The party does need funding to have some full-time staff also. Even those full-time staff need, the party needs to hold all full-time staff accountable, not just the prominent elected representatives. But part of the functioning of the party, and this is why Socialist Alternative has been so successful in the work we have done, even though we are such a small organization of just 1,000 members, is that we not only do research in general, but we do political analysis, including what we call perspectives, where we take very seriously studying the objective conditions politically and socially, and then mapping out what we feel is going to happen in the future. We may not always be right about it, but having that kind of, an eye to the future based on what we think is going to happen with our best political guests, very educated guests, so to say, that is very important, because then it's important that helps you succeed for the most part. Just to give you a concrete example, as I said, whether or not to make $15 an hour was not a straightforward question, because when we announced our campaign, it wasn't fully clear that $15 an hour was going to take off, because the success is rooted in whether hundreds of thousands of workers are going to embrace that concrete demand as something that they want to fight around. And so for Socialist Alternative, the challenge was, having the perspective that we believe $15 an hour will capture the imagination of Seattle's working class people, and that we should make it the most prominent demand on the banner. So, and that turned out right. I'm not saying that we were always right, but I'm saying that having that serious approach to political analysis is also crucial.
I have a question. What is your experience with converting persuadable voters by making a strong argument based in values?
So most of the time, the kind of arguments we make are, first of all, they're very, they take into account the realities that the people we're talking to face, and at the same time, they're also, it meets people where they're at, but also challenges them to go beyond where they are. So, for example, in our district, we have, it's a majority renter district, so we don't have to convince renters about renters' rights, because they're living the struggle. And so it's very clear to them why they need to support our office, why they need to come out and speak in public testimony, fight alongside us at our rallies and protest marches, because that it directly affects their lives for the better or worse, depending on whether we win something or not. But when we talk about renters' rights to many homeowners, we talk about how the overall housing struggle is affecting both middle class and working class homeowners and renters, and that we should not be, we are all working people, we should not be pitted against one another, because the reality is that the lion's share of the wealth that has created this housing crisis is going to the multimillionaires and the billionaires. And really, if you're looking to blame somebody, it's not renters, it's the big developers, the property management corporations, everybody who's, just leeching off renters, but also the big banks, the equity funds, all of which together have also, skyrocketed land value, which makes home ownership even more, more and more basically out of reach. I mean, Generation Z, it is basically not possible for them to buy homes anymore. So, we build solidarity by explaining to people who the real obstacles to social justice are and who the real enemy is, and that we need unity in the working class.
How do you feel about the idea of a progressive legislation written by the people and given to candidates and incumbents as an ultimatum? And also, can you give a concrete example of how you use your office to boost other social movements?
Sorry, the ultimatum. Yeah, of course, absolutely. I think we should be doing that. In fact, it's an important thing as part of accountability, where working people are able to together write a legislation. But I don't think that. I mean, I agree with that absolutely. I'm just trying to explain that it's not so much about writing the legislation. It's about politically how will we make that ultimatum. So making an ultimatum cannot just be we deliver a manifesto and then we say we are giving you an ultimatum. The question is, do we have the political heft to back it up, to really pose a threat to the political careers of these elected officials? That's what it comes down to. That's how we have won victories, because the very visible social struggles that we have built completely changes the consciousness of working people. And these are the same people voting for the Democrats. And the reason we have won these victories was not because ultimately we convinced the Democrats to vote yes on 15 because it's the right thing to do. No, they voted yes, even though they opposed it, because they knew that it was going to challenge their own political career. So in other words, ultimately, what if you want to call it ultimatum, that has to have actual political might behind it, because ultimately it's a balance of forces. This is class struggle. The ruling class, the bosses, the capitalists, the big business owners, and the politicians that represent them, their parties, Republicans, Democrats, they hold the overwhelming balance of power. That's the status quo. If you're going to win something, then we have to overcome that imbalance of power. And so in other words, it's about changing the balance of forces. And the only way you can do that when they have all the wealth and political influence is by uniting large numbers of working people around a common agenda. So ultimately it comes, that political heft that I'm talking about is building mass movements. And a concrete example of how we have used our office to amplify other struggles, I mean, there's endless examples, honestly, but I'll give you a very recent example. As soon as the Starbucks struggle, unionizing struggle began, we immediately got in touch with Starbucks workers. But when I say we, I don't just mean my office and Socialist Alternative in Seattle, but Socialist Alternative nationwide. We came into contact with Starbucks workers. In fact, some of our own members are Starbucks workers who are also building towards a union election in their own stores in Boston and in Seattle and also in Chicago. And so we immediately held organizing meetings with them to see how we can help them, not only win the, store by store union elections, but, can we build for a fighting political strategy? And so one of the things that we did was bring a resolution to Seattle City Council in favor of Starbucks workers. That was in favor of their unionizing struggle. That was the first such resolution that was passed. Just 2 weeks ago, Alderman Byron Lopez, who I mentioned, my fellow DSA elected representatives, who's also a fighter, he brought it to the Chicago City Council and they passed it there, again, because of the pressure of workers. And as we speak, my staff are in Marysville, which is a town that's neighboring in Seattle, an hour's drive from here, with Starbucks workers who are on strike today. And I personally was there 2 days ago. They've been on strike every single day for 3 days. And then on April 23rd, we are organizing a rally along with the Starbucks Workers United, the union, and many other rank and file union members. Many unions have endorsed, other unions have endorsed that rally. So that's that's a concrete way in which we are building this struggle. And our branch in New York is directly working alongside fighting alongside the Amazon Labor Union, and they're leafleting and tabling with them every single day to help the union election succeed that's coming up in April.
Legally, what is Socialist Alternative, a 501c4 or something else?
Yes, it is a 501c4. So it's basically it has nonprofit status, but we are a political organization. So we do endorse candidates.
We have another rather long question. What are your thoughts on some leftists that are embracing class reductionism and essentially ignoring marginalized communities, sometimes outright discriminating against them as a third-party political strategy? So there's research for non-voters consists of many diverse communities. How does a third party reach the widest group of non-voters without essentially selling out to those who are progressive, who need progressive policies the most?
Obviously, as a socialist, as a Marxist, I reject class reductionism, and there is no hope of building any kind of change without also fighting. There's no hope of ending economic exploitation if we also don't fight for a society free of oppression. And really, what does it even mean to be a socialist if you're not against oppression? And if you don't recognize that oppressions are a result of an exploitative system like capitalism, as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. And so, needless to say, that is absolutely, it has to be clear. I would say I'm a little surprised with this question because I don't see, if I was to if you were to ask me what's the biggest issue in the United States in terms of what are the obstacles to building a united left, obstacles to building working class solidarity, winning victories, and so on, I don't know that class reductionism is where it's at. I think it's the opposite. It's what's happened in a big way is that the ruling class has recognized over the last decade, especially since Occupy, that working people, American people, but especially younger generations, tens of millions of young people are rejecting the status quo. They are not invested in the capitalist system, whether they are thinking about it in those terms or not. They are fed up with the status quo. They are they feel demoralized and betrayed by the Democrats and Republicans, certainly. And they're looking for an alternative. And if in that context you have actual political leadership, if you were to have, just like we have provided in Seattle, then you can move mountains. You can completely shift. Seattle's political agenda has completely shifted because of us, which is why the ruling class has left no stone unturned, basically, to try and get us out. In fact, less than a year after we won our third election, we had a recall campaign against us, and we won that campaign in December. But what happened in December, and this is a very good example to answer this question, is in the same year, last year, when we won our election against the recall attempt, even though we had everything stacked against us, and the Supreme Court of Washington State, whether intentionally or otherwise, they helped the recall campaign by allowing them to put it on a December ballot, which is the first time Seattle has ever seen a December ballot. And so we had everything stacked against us. Working people had everything stacked against us. And the ruling class thought they had defeated us. We were still able to defeat them. And yet, two self-described progressives, Lorena Gonzalez and Nikita Oliver, both lost their elections, and they were handily defeated by their corporate Democrat opponents. And that really shows you that the main challenge facing us on the American left at this moment is, how do we actually build working class solidarity on a principled basis? I don't think that there is any lack of understanding, especially among younger people, that we have to fight against racism and sexism. Look, George Floyd became the largest street protest movement in US history because 26 million people marched out in multi-racial, multi-gender working class solidarity. That is the potential we have for building unity. But we are not going to build unity unless we explain to people that the fight against oppression goes hand in hand with the fight against economic exploitation. But if we don't fight on the economic issues, it is detrimental disproportionately to communities of color. And on top of that, it ends up enabling the right wing. So in other words, if the Biden administration, just concretely posing this, had even won the $15 minimum wage, even that, it would have done a lot to undercut the traction that the right is getting in their racist and sexist agenda. I mean, I don't think we should assume that the South or certain states or certain people are just racist and that's just going to stay that way. It doesn't work that way. I mean, people are not etched in stone, and racism is not natural, it's socialized. And the best way of fighting against that is to build solidarity on a working class basis. And I'm not, you don't have to take my word for it. Look at the support that Bernie's campaign had in all these southern states that went for Trump. Look at the fact that when Trump won Florida in 2020, but the same election in Florida had working people voting in a majority for a $15 minimum wage. So, you can see that these things are complex, and we should not write people off. Yes, there is a current of reactionary and dangerous right populism, and we should not kid ourselves about how serious that challenge is. However, we have to also understand that a whole host of people are winnable if we can show them that we are fighting together for the common goals that we have across race, across gender, as working people.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Lots to think about. Really appreciate your efforts and all that you do. Thank you so much. Jonathan's going to do a little bit of a summary now of what we've heard. So if you can go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm not going to say much, but just to remind people what the presentations were about, Jeremy's and Kshama's. Well, of course, Noel and I talked about the case for building a truly progressive party and about why that needs to be done from the bottom up. Jeremy illustrated that through his discussion of the history of the bottom-up success of the Vermont Progressive Party, starting at the municipal level with Bernie and some of his allies and building up to the state and even federal level. And he also discussed various policy victories that have been achieved by the Vermont Progressive Party. So they have had some real success there that's worth noting. Now, Kshama talked, she made a strong case for building a viable working class party through independent working class candidates, and having those campaigns strongly linked to and helping to build movements, and also a strong electoral organization that can, at the same time, keep those candidates accountable. I know she had more to say, but those are kind of the sort of the central messages that I took from her presentation. And I would just add one more thing. Kshama did talk about how it's not just accumulating electoral victories, and I agree with that. I think her case illustrates how just having one person on a body, on a city council, can make a huge difference in terms of leveraging a lot of changes. For example, $15 an hour minimum wage, which not only was passed in Seattle, but then started to spread around the country. So it's not just about an accumulation, it's about getting in there and having a voice and exercising power, linking to movements that can also pressure other politicians to do more of the right thing.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would agree with that. We saw that here in Boulder County with the Board of Regents. You can vote, you can run on to get on the Board of Regents at the university or a college, and the school board. We have a lot of MAGA people trying to get on our school boards here in Colorado, probably all across the nation. And one person can really make a huge difference. So good idea. So to get involved with Progressive Party Builders, you can go to our website, progressivepartybuilders.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and I think Sarah might put those links in the chat. And you can also donate. We are, I'll state again what we are. Our focus is endorsing candidates with not only monetary support, but other kinds of support and training, so forth, hosting workshops like this, and collaborating with and influencing other like-minded party building efforts. So to become a member, you can go to our website and sign up, and we will then invite you to all of our other events and workshops, and we will try to get you involved in our organization based on your skills and your interest. Our next workshop is going to be about how to organize, how to campaign, and how to win local races and build local parties. And we haven't picked a date or a time yet, but we will definitely email everyone who's in attendance about the details of that event. We're going to do another final question and answer period here. We're going to go, we are right at 1:30, so we'll go for a couple questions. And then if you would like to have a discussion or say a few words, we will, once we say goodbye to people who have other things going on in their day, we'll open it up for other comments and questions. So any other final questions or questions now that you'd like to bring up? Sarah, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, this is a question for Councilmember Sawant. How did you build a movement in Washington where you were able to run 2 successful campaigns, and how can your tactics be expanded nationally?
Sorry, can you read the question again?
Yes. You said that you were able to have 2 successful campaigns in Washington State. How do you recommend that's expanded on the national level?
Right. I think fundamentally, if we want to win on a national level, it probably won't be that much different than what we ran. Obviously, details will be different. Logistically, as I said, it will be like if we were running in a congressional district, then in a congressional race, then the size of the electorate that we have to reach would be larger. And in that sense, it would have to be a campaign on a larger scale. But essentially, the political strategy that we used is absolutely something that it's not something that's restricted to a local election. It's in general, that is the strategy we have used, whether it is electoral campaigns or other things that we have won. For example, when we won the Amazon tax, we used a similar strategy. And that strategy is basically, first of all, recognizing, which race to run in, and the campaign program is absolutely critical. So what you're going to call for in the campaign is extremely important. I mean, one of the reasons that some of the candidates, like Nikita Oliver, for example, but that's far from the only example, ended up losing in their election is because they believe, whether well-meaning or otherwise, I'm not there to divine what's in their heads, but the outcome, I'm just talking about the outcomes. It's driven, their approach is driven by this belief that you shouldn't rock the Democratic Party boat. The best chance you have of winning elections is if you curry favor with the current power basis in your city or congressional district, whatever. So when we ran our first campaign in 2013, when nobody knew about socialist alternative, there were many Democrats, prominent Democrats, some of whom went on to win their congressional races as Democrats later on, who were sort of aghast at the way we were running our campaign. And, I was told, like, do you have to say you're a socialist at the start of every speech? Do you have to talk about $15 an hour in every speech? And, oh, you're not going to win unless you take corporate money, and so on and so forth. But we showed that it was possible to win a campaign on that basis. So in other words, we have won and some other progressives have lost actually because they went the other way, where they thought currying favor with the Democrats was the better way to go. And so we have seen campaigns like we saw in Seattle last year, where they aligned themselves with progressive Democrats. And because it comes at a price. You don't just get to align with progressive Democrats, get their endorsements on your leaflets, on your campaign mailers for no price. I mean, there's a price tag attached to it. And the price tag is you don't fight for anything concrete. So it's one thing to say, I support working people. It's quite another to say, I'm calling for $15 an hour. The role of concrete demands is often not understood, because when you make something concrete, you are directly posing a threat to the ruling class's agenda. So we didn't go around saying, I support a living wage. We don't believe $15 is a living wage. It's not in Seattle. However, it was going to be a 60% jump in wages. It lifted 100,000 people. When we won it, it lifted 100,000 workers out of dire poverty. So it was going to be absolutely historic. However, stating the number 15 was where it was. I mean, that was where the battle was, because if you don't say that, one, you don't pose a threat to the ruling class, and second, you don't galvanize workers. So if people want to understand, how could we run a congressional campaign taking the lessons from Seattle, that is one big lesson. Having concrete demands is absolutely crucial. So if we were running a congressional campaign, for example, we should have $15 an hour, Medicare for all. We should have a very clear stance on the war on Ukraine. All those things have to be, canceling debt, taxing big business, taxing Wall Street to fund housing, social housing. Those are examples of the demands we should raise. And obviously, depending on which district we're running in, the issues are going to be different. So the demands I'm coming up with are, if we were to run in Washington State, but if we are going to run in some other state, there might be other demands that we believe will galvanize working people. And that has to be the central question. What are the demands that will bring hundreds of thousands of working people into action, really make them feel involved, have them become part of the campaign. Obviously, hundreds of thousands will not become part of your campaign actively, but hundreds have to be. So in Seattle, we won because our campaign was so exciting that it brought hundreds of people, volunteers, in addition to our paid staff, who did leafletting and tabling, and we talked to everybody that we could talk to, and we were very, very systematic, very disciplined, and very, very careful about making sure that we hit all the doors. I know another speaker emphasized this. I absolutely agree with them that we have to have a serious approach to winning elections. That's what we will need to do congressionally also. But politically speaking, I think we have to be very clear. It has to be a complete break from the Democrats. If you do this halfway house kind of thing, working people will see through it and they will not get involved, and you will end up losing elections. I mean, just in closing, look at the unfortunate defeat of Nina Turner. I mean, she could have won her election, but she did not actually raise the demands prominently that she stands for. I mean, it does not help if your campaign website says Nina Turner stands for Medicare for all. No, you have to say that at the doors repeatedly ad nauseum. One of the reasons Bernie's campaign had so much impact is that he had a stump speech and people made fun of him constantly. The bourgeois establishment made fun of him constantly, but he completely ignored it because he understood that is how you reach working people. You constantly hammer at the concrete demands you stand for. Taxing Wall Street, Medicare for all, that is how you win people who will otherwise be fodder for the right wing. And had Nina Turner done that, she could have successfully eliminated the confusion that resulted because of the Democratic establishment's chicanery, running a black woman against her, corporate woman against her, and then completely confusing people's consciousness. A black woman running against a black woman, whom do you vote for? And there were people who were on the ground who said, I supported Bernie, I support 15, I support Medicare for all, but I had no idea Nina Turner supported all this. Well, there you go. That's the difference between victory and defeat.
Thank you so much. That's exactly right on. We're going to turn the recording off right now, and we'll stay on if for any other questions, but we're just going to stop recording. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and we'll be in touch. But if you would like to stay and keep discussing, please feel free. And we'll answer a couple more questions. Go ahead, Sarah.